Welcome. My name is Nick Grounds and I'm a national demonstrator, and I'm delighted to be able to share with you today my demonstration entitled Renewal, Rebirth and Recycle. I am, like many of you I'm sure, missing demonstrating and flower clubs, so my thanks to all those who have worked so hard to bring this national show together. And it's a joy to welcome you and to be able to share it with you. Now, my design has come from various elements of the title and what I can find in the back of the shed. And I'm hoping that that combination will produce some interesting arrangements that you might be able to have a go at home, but will allow you to appreciate the extraordinary material that we have the benefit of being able to work with. Many centuries ago, an American tribal leader was quoted as saying, "A twig is weak, but a bundle is strong." And I believe that that's an extremely apt quotation for Nafas, the association that we belong to and that allows us to share the magic of flowers and friendship. So what have I discovered at the back of the shed? Two things in particular. One, a glass bowl, 33 centimetres diameter, 13 centimetres deep, used usually with moss lining and floral foam, into which I then place a traditional mast style arrangement. The other element is this, and this is the traditional wooden dolly peg given to me some years ago by Santa Claus, aka my mother-in-law. Now, they look fabulous, but the problem is practical. I have yet to be able to successfully hang out the washing because material and the rotary line are thicker than the gap between the prongs. My dilemma is that I don't want to lose out on any future generosity from Father Christmas, so how do I make use of these and still keep in with my mother-in-law? Well, fortuitously, I've discovered that these fit just over the top of the glass rim of the bowl. So by adding two pegs, I'm starting to form a structure that will allow me then to build my design, and a design that is moving away from reliance on floral foam. I find that we're in an extraordinary time of changing techniques and of amazing possibilities. And for me, the challenge isn't actually one of materials and mechanics, it's a challenge of expectations. But if we can just relax into our journey, then we can come up with an endless variety of flower arranging techniques and styles. So my two pegs, a plastic test tube. This is acrylic, important whenever ordering test tubes to rely on acrylic rather than plastic, because plastic can often be opaque, whereas the acrylic is clear. And this is lovely, it's 15 centimetres deep, which means it sits above the rim of the container and just above the head of the dolly pegs. And then a wire, fairly thick gauged wire, 35 centimetres long, which I've cut in half, and then I'm taking the wire, placing them around two fingers and just bend them into a pin. And with my test tube, I can place that between the two pegs, push the wire over the heads of the dolly pegs and join them together at the back with a twist of the wire. And then using a pair of pliers, I can just place the pliers over the wire, pull gently away from the test tube and twist a couple of times, and that will secure the pegs and the test tube in place and give me the basis of my structure. Now you can see as I start to build this up why my wife has referred to it as the Charlotte Russe flower arrangement, and it is a little bit like a Charlotte Russe. It reminds me very much of my grandmother, who often made Charlotte Russes using sponge fingers. We loved the sponge fingers, but were always very wary of the contents to which they were added. So we generally took the fingers off the arrangement of the pudding. So we just pull that in place. And we keep working our way around 2 pegs and a test tube in sequence. And it'll take about 43 tubes and 43 pegs to make up our basis of the structure. Now before I add any other material to it, I need to just consider what I'm going to do with the base in the middle, and I'm going to put into that moss, some flat moss, which I can then just tease gently between the test tubes. I'm not trying to hide the base of the test tube as such, but just have the moss pushing through between them. And that will add some visual weight into the middle of the design and draw the eye down into the middle, where you can always put something at a later point. The wires that I've used, I've left in place, put into the middle of the arrangement, and we'll make use of those now as we add material. And I'm going to start with this. This is the Salix daphnoides, more often known colloquially as the pussy willow, and I've particularly selected this because it's got 3 or 4 breaks, and that will give me greater flexibility when I'm building the structure. And I'm sitting it just straight into the glass bowl behind each test tube. And I feel I can do that because I don't need to rely on it necessarily sitting in water to be able to survive, because it will dry out naturally, but I could always add some water to the base if I wanted to. Salix britensis, a prolific grower of willow, has this wonderful golden auburn colour, and I've got a couple of stems there. I'm just going to add them again onto the next gap between the tubes and the pegs, and just push the wire into the back to hold it in place. And then another piece of pussy willow which we just pull in. Now this actually came from the wholesaler, but I have been known to cut pussy willow from lay-bys on various A-roads around the country. And then there are times where we've got stems that are just coming out at an angle, and I want to just wire those into place. So with a little bit of wire I can just add some strength to the stems as we build them up. I also want to add some horizontality. Now for me, we've got quite a rigid linear structure going in place, and the eye can very easily be taken up and out of the arrangement, so you can miss everything. But something like this is the contorted hazel, but contorted willow is just as effective. And when we add that in, it allows us to incorporate an element of horizontality which breaks up the vision. So just wire a little bit in place, but you can see how now that is starting to just soften the design and keep the eye down. There's an element of interest. And then we add in the final piece of pussy willow and just feed that in around the stems like so. And you can see, I hope, that where I've introduced that contorted hazel and willow, it has given us a horizontal line that keeps the eye within the arrangement. I fill it with water, so there's water in each of these test tubes, and I've used one of these water containers with the fixed tube. Brilliant for putting water in, but the key I've also learnt is that once you've finished your arrangement and dismantled it, there may be bits of water left in the bottom of the test tubes, and that needs to be taken out so that it doesn't stay and fester in the bottom. So take a traditional straw, push it over the nozzle of your container, and with it empty of water, squeeze it, hold it squeezed, push the straw into the test tube, and then release the pressure on the container, and that will allow any excess water still in the bottom of the tube to be sucked up, and you keep the tube clean. Before we start with our flowers, one other crucial point. Have with you either a little jar like that, or as you may find, something that you dig up in the garden. This, I think, probably was a traditional old pill container, and I've dug it from the garden. It's gone into the washing machine, and I can just keep that there. Either of them are essential, because if you have any flowers that are left as you start to do your arrangement, you can pop the little stems into those, and you've got an extra tiny arrangement that will give joy wherever you place it. So I will keep that to hand and just fill it with water. For the flowers. Now, I watched a film recently, The Book Club, and for me, the line of the film was, I feel less spring flowers and more potpourri. And I have to confess that in recent months, I have very often felt extremely potpourri. But I've found some magic. I've had the joy of going to the wholesalers. Now, my problem when I go to the wholesalers is that I inevitably pick something up and go, wow. Then I look at something else, which I think is more wow than what I've just looked at. So I have to have that as well. So I end up coming home with far more material than I ever need, but I have enjoyed the process of overbuying, and that may be part of the journey we're under. But let's start with some material. I've got here a stem of Forsythia intermedea spectabilis. Intermedea because it is the joining together of two separate parent plants to form this Forsythia. Forsythia flowers on new wood, so once it's finished flowering, prune it back each year and you'll get another fresh growth. As you place it in, cut the stem at a slight angle so that when you drop it into the tube, it's already angled so it doesn't sit flush on the bottom of the test tube. It sits slightly proud so that water can still get up into the stem. Liatris spectabilis, extraordinary spires of flower, and this has got beautiful deep purple, and again we just drop that into our test tube and we can weave it in amongst our structure to make sure that it holds securely in place. And we just work these round, adding our flowers as we go along in no particular order, and we might do one or two at different heights so that it keeps the eye top and bottom. I toyed with the idea as to whether I needed to keep my flowers all at one level, and I was tempted to do that because I'd already got a very strong line here, and I wondered whether I should carry it on in strict lines. I'm thinking as I go along that I might be more tempted to just go at different heights, but there is an endless possibility of how you construct them. This is the Polyanthes tuberosa, sometimes known as the Polyanthus lily. It's a tuberous bulb, so it seems to be a combination of both elements. Grows in the garden and it can be used, or flowers in the autumn. The key is that it smells. Now I'm sorry that you can't share the scent of this flower. I wish we were actually doing a scenter video so that you can pick up the smells, but smells are extraordinary and over recent months have been very, very important, and so a little flower can be, especially one that's fragrant, can be a lifesaver, quite literally. We've got, growing in the garden at the moment, the Sarcocoa, the winter box, and if you haven't got a plant of that in your garden, please try and find one. It's a winter sensation. See what I've done there? But it is extraordinary and a really lovely plant to use. So we're starting to build up our framework using the Polyanthus lily and the Liatris. I'm then going to add something that I appreciate is perhaps less spring-like, but it's amazing. This is the Clematis Inspiration, a fabulous pink clematis with a wonderful shape to it that allows us just to push it into the arrangement and feed the flowers through the stems. This one is Clematis Blue Pirouette. You can almost imagine the ballerina doing the dance. I've cut quite a lot of the leaves off just to reduce the weight. I want the delicacy of that flower rather than the weight of the leaf. Some of the tuberoses down low, pushing them into that water and making sure I'd filled the water to the rim of the bowl so that there was still space, so that when I pushed the stem in, the water was displaced but not out of the container. And what you'll realise as you go along is that actually with a test tube you need to be able to refill it much more frequently than if it was sitting in floral foam. So always allow access to get the nozzle of your water container into it. One of the messages that I begin to pick up from flower arranging is the importance of allowing your material to speak to you. So listen to what the material has to say. Watch the shape and see how that shape is going to dictate. Gertrude Jekyll, an extraordinary gifted, she called herself an amateur, a working amateur, but she always used to go on about how it was important to learn what to put in, but it was equally important to acquire the wisdom to know what to leave out. And space is so important in the arrangements that we make. This is the hellebore, the winter rose. This is hellebore Queen's bread. Hellebores are exquisite. How is it that these beautiful, beautiful flowers push through the glum elements of winter and still seem to thrive? And I've cut these quite short, and I'm just going to place them around the base, and they'll hopefully soften the impact of that divide between the test tubes and the structure. A dark colour, so it picks up the element of colour in the Salix daphnoides, but we can just work those round, and the leaf can be folded back, just softening that edge. Absolutely joyous. This is the Viburnum opulus, sometimes known as a sterile viburnum because it doesn't have a pollen. It has the most sensational lime green, a real zing of fresh rebirth of spring. Can be tricky, especially when purchased early before the garden shrubs are ready. I've cut a lot of the leaf off just to give maximum opportunity for water to get to the heads, but I've left a few and they just dabble away up on the top of that wooden stem, and by placing that in, it begins, see how it just lifts it, and that colour then draws in, and we're allowed to see some of the darker elements of purple. Tease some of the heads, if you can, through the structure so that they float around just inside. It adds a little bit of depth to the arrangement, draws the eye in. I couldn't resist this. This is a rare piece of plant material. It's known as Hedera helix in the graveyard. We have a graveyard next to us at work, and the ivy this year has been fantastic, and the heads, extraordinary seed heads with just a couple of leaves, and we can push those into the test tube, and the leaf just adds an element. I've actually decided to leave that hanging out at the moment, but I might bring it back in as I come towards the end of the design. We'll see how it goes. So having cut a flower, I'm left with this little bit which I'm not sure I'm going to use, but this is where my little jar comes into place, and I can just place that into the jar and it'll sit there, and I can add to it as I go along. The great thing about the clematis is that you have these very delicate heads that you can manoeuvre around, but also the stem is quite thin, so when you're working with test tubes, it means that you've got a chance of getting 2 or 3 heads into a test tube rather than just one thick stem. So that's why I tend, I think, to find that I use them far more than I perhaps would have done previously, because they're so versatile. I've found this. Now, ivy was an odd thing. Do I need to add ivy or not? I don't know. But the reason I had to go with this was because of the incredible colours on this piece of ivy. And it's where the sun has been shining onto it, and it's been growing close up on a tree. And it's got these beautiful sort of burgundy colours, which actually blend in surprisingly well with the stems of willow. So I can just feel, I've only got the one stem of that, but it was one that I couldn't resist. And I'll just add that in the back, feeding it through the structure. When purchasing the viburnum, I often find that actually it's better to get the best grade that you possibly can, because that way you get far more heads to be able to cut. So I could cut that one off, and then I've still got 3 heads. Bit worried about that piece there, so I'm going to cut it at an angle, which hopefully then it looks less obvious when you place it into the arrangement. Using the stem of the early flowering cherry there, I've just put that flower head behind that, and that has pulled it up, because very often the hellebore has a tendency for its head to drop down, and that just pulls it up to a height where you can appreciate it far more. And something that this is probably an element that I didn't need to acquire, but it looked nice at the wholesalers. This is the panicum grass, and I love how delicate it is, but also just introduces the odd leaf, which can, I think, add to the structure, because you can work that leaf around the design and add another horizontal element, and it gives a softness to the structure. Using our ivy head, just take a cut of the head, push that in deep, and then we might have a leaf or 2 left. Just cut the leaf and push that in. We're left then with a celebration of the dolly peg, the glass dish that may not be so useful for holding floral foam, but can still hold a structure, and a tiny little vase of pieces, the bits that we might otherwise discard, which can be placed somewhere on a side table, so that every time you go past, you stop, you look, and you celebrate the extraordinary material that we can use in our flowers. And so we're left with our Charlotte Russe, the contents of which, I must confess, are more appealing than some of the contents that my grandmother used to put into her ruses. But what a joy to rediscover structure, shape, texture, the dolly peg from the back of the shed, and the magic of the restarting of spring.